Everybody, so we've opened up the waiting room. Welcome in, everybody. Take your time to get settled in here. So great to have you join us for what is actually our very first hybrid event of 2022, even though, we've been in operation since January. We are so very excited to have a group of folks with us back in Force Space once again to hold this conversation. So officially, good afternoon. Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue.
Bonjour.
On behalf of Concordia University's Force Space, which is where we are currently located on unceded Indigenous lands in Duggan, Montreal. Force Space is activated daily via live events such as this one to create engagement around the various research projects and initiatives and dialogues in development and happening across the university. So to that end, it's our pleasure to welcome you in for the ABCs of Dramaturgical Ecologies, this being the second event in a series organized by Concordia-based multi-disciplinary group of artists and researchers interested in the ecologies of dramaturgical processes. So I'll pass it over to today's moderator, Dana Duggan, in just a minute to get you all situated, comfortable, and excited for this conversation. But before doing so, I'll just mention we are in a meeting format, which is wonderful because it gives you access to everything. If you want to jump into the conversation with questions and comments, you know the rules of engagement. Chat's open. You're welcome to raise a virtual hand, ask a question during a kind of question period, and share your comments with us that way if you feel comfortable doing so. And finally, I'll just mention that we are live streaming this dialogue onto our YouTube channel, and I will pop that link into the chat momentarily. So happily, over to you, Dana. Welcome to Force Space.
Thank you. I'm actually going to pass it off to Ange first, right? You're going to do the...
Yes, I'll do. Okay? Hi, all. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Anna. I'm going to start by a full-blown Concordia Territorial Acknowledgement. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Welcome, everyone, and my name is Angélique Wilkie, and I am associate professor in the contemporary dance department here at Concordia. I'm not sure where, it's kind of funny to be staring up at this screen, so I'm not going to stare at y'all. I'm going to stare over here. But I think I just want to preface all of this by saying that the territorial acknowledgement for me is not just a symbolic gesture. My particular interest is in bodies, the social inscription of bodies, and how that relates to the creative processes that we engage in particular in contemporary dance, but beyond that in the performing disciplines. And for me, the social inscriptions of bodies cannot be separated from the lands on which they find themselves. So I want to invite us all to just take a couple of seconds and think about where we are, where we consider ourselves to be from, what we do, and the relationship between all of those different elements. Dramaturgical Ecologies is a research project funded by the provincial and federal funding agencies here, and the primary focus of that project is really around the idea that bodies are not neutral canvases, and that's an interrogation that I am constantly playing with, scratching at, digging through, primarily in the context of contemporary dance, but also in circus and theater. What does it mean to be a vehicle for somebody else's vision? How does that instrumentalize or not? What are issues around agency? Through looking at all of that, with an amazing group of research colleagues. I'm going to call you all, not assistants, but colleagues, because I wouldn't be where I am without you all. We've come to a place, looking through my own experience, to a place where we're looking at two conceptual pillars. One is blackness and the other is dramaturgy. It's certainly not the only lens, but it has become the what I would describe as, the pillars. And there's a movement between those two conceptual pillars that we're interested in exploring further. One of the projects that has emerged out of that interrogation is the idea of a vocabulando, which is a vocabulary in movement, in motion. And that the concepts that emerge out of looking at blackness and dramaturgy in that context generate their own language. And so we've identified keywords that serve as motors to our thinking. And this series, ABCs of Dramaturgical Ecologies, is really intended to capture, I won't say reflect, but to capture this movement that we're interested in exploring. So the keywords that have been chosen for today's encounter between Funmi and Stéphane are diaspora and praxis. I'm going to stop there and pass the mic, because I could keep going for a little while. I'm going to pass the mic to the...
My own mic.
Well, yes, you have your own mic. All right, I'm not going to pass the mic. I'm going to keep my mic and get Dana to use her mic. So the research assistant who is guiding this conversation today is Dana Duggan. And Dana, you're on.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Force Space. Thank you, Force Space, for hosting us, and we're excited to be the first group in this hybrid since we all got locked up again. Thank you, Angelique, for that. Sorry, that's on. Thank you for introducing and giving us the background and context for what we're doing here today. Just a quick introduction of myself. My name is Dana Duggan, and I'm an artist scholar, PhD student in the Humanities Interdisciplinary Program at Concordia. And before I actually go into like the nitty-gritty and the meat of this conversation, I just wanted to actually take a moment, because there's something that kind of came into my life last night on the eve of preparing for this, and it was that just 2 days from now will mark the anniversary, the 53rd anniversary of the Sir George Williams University Computer Center occupation. And 3 years ago, they had an event here that was a 10-day series that actually Stéphane was a part of, and it was really beautiful. I wasn't here at the time when that was going on, but if you have a chance to look at the videos and see all of the activity around that event, it's really amazing. And also the fact that it's Black History Month, I feel like it just take a moment to think about the kind of things that have actually happened on this place where we are right now at Concordia. And I also wanted, I'm going to digress and kind of do this thing that's disobedience that I do sometimes. And so I have something I want to read that was from some of the organizers of the protest and pedagogy at Concordia, or that were part of the project that I was talking about that happened 3 years ago. And I can't like turn everything off, but I think that if you like close your eyes and just listen to what I read, it might be kind of an interesting thing to do. Anyways, still demanding justice. We are once again in a season of protest. In 1969, students at Concordia protested anti-Black racism by occupying the university's computer center for 2 weeks. Outside, others carried signs which marked their connections to a worldwide struggle of Black rights. On the 14th day of their occupation, a fire was lit. It caused nearly $2 million in damage and imperiled their lives, forcing the protesters to hack their way out of the computer center with an emergency axe. The police, called by the university's administration, assaulted and arrested nearly 100 people fleeing the fire. Some of those same students were jailed anywhere from 6 to 16 months, threatened with deportation, and Trinidad and Tobago, which only had gained independence 7 years earlier, bailed out 10 of their nationals due to bail set extraordinarily high, ranging from $1,000 to $15,000. In remembering this event, I'm just going to say it from the context that they're reading it, sorry, but we ask the duty of justice, do we owe the past and what are the connections to the present? Should the Trinidad government be repaid the bail money? Was 1960s Canada really any less racist than the segregated US? Why in a nation of apologies has there been no apology issued for this event? In this moment, institutions around the world are grappling with the legacies of slavery, anti-Black racism, and police brutality. Protests and pedagogy had convened this conversation as part of the 2-week program in February 2019, meant to remember and reflect on the 1969 protests. They shared the videos with Concordia to reground the issue of reparative justice. Such a lens moves beyond the corporate discourse of equity and inclusion and dominates universities' diversity management policies. In the US, Ivy League schools such as Yale, Harvard, Princeton, and Columbia are questioning the symbolic and material afterlife of slave ownership found in the source of endowments. In South Africa, a movement to decolonize universities by challenging white curricula and removing imperial statues had rippled effects. Oxford University debated its imperial ties, and Glasgow University has become the first British university to admit it benefited from slavery and is seeking to make amends. In Canada, prominent universities like Dalhousie and McGill also had founders who were pro-slavery and slavery owners, respectively. In the worldwide context of universities beginning to address their relationship to slavery and anti-Black racism, does Concordia carry any responsibility here? And what is that responsibility? Is it financial responsibility and/or responsibility to seek truth and to reconcile with those original protesters and the communities to which they belong, and for whom the event still emphasizes a legacy of discrimination and enforced inequality? After all, those students were among the most talented from their Caribbean islands, and their aim was to enter medical school, and many of their lives, although still remarkably successful, were transformed by these events. Canada in the 1960s distanced itself from racist practices in the US as it does now, though the image of a polite, harmonious nation, but should the politics of an apology extend to the Black community as a whole in Canada? The starting point for Concordia would be an institutional apology for calling the police on Black students in 1965, but also attention to the further demands the students made in 1969, including their call for Black studies and what was the Sir George Williams University, now Concordia. I just want to take like just 30 seconds just to sit with that. Okay, thank you for letting me do that little detour. Just gonna, in the interest of honoring the current socio-political context and what we're dealing with, and as I'm the person representing kind of the face of Dramaturgical Ecologies, we like to honor the complexity and tensions that are inherent in the work that we're doing and our different racial positionings in our working group and at large. So I'm publicly taking inventory and acknowledging my positionality. My body is not neutral and whiteness is not universal. To do this, and to acknowledge, part of my acknowledgement of my positionality is that I must first locate my whiteness in relation to Blackness and acknowledge its centeredness in our current socio-political context. As Dana, situated in this moment with my own embodied dramaturgy, I move through the world as a white artist, lover, mother, some of you know the rest of that, toward queering whiteness, to uncrown whiteness and resist its reproduction and production. Okay. So this event today, we're sort of trying to experiment with what it means to bring thinkers and creators together around like in a conceptual playground, and kind of pushing back on some of the sort of oppressive and violent practices that come with institutional performance. So we're sort of staging this as more conversational, as if they were sitting in a bar having a drink, talking about, you know, praxis and diaspora. as if. No, it actually happens all the time. It's kind of in the vein of what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney might call the undercommons, which is the margins of the university activity, and sort of rethinking what study is. And so, you know, there may be a little bit of awkwardness and clumsiness, but that's what comes with experimentation, and we are all for it. So I'm particularly clumsy sometimes, so please, there might be an accidental jerk alert. So, all right. So let's get back to business here. So first of all, I just want to say how excited I am to have these two amazing presenters here that have agreed to do this thing with us. They have so much to offer, such rich and diverse backgrounds, not just in their intellectual practices, but also in their creative practices, which we are really trying to privilege a lot in this conversation because it's often not. So I'm gonna begin, well, I was gonna try to do maybe something a little bit more experimental with their bios, but I just wanna start that what we're trying to draw with them is the richness of the multidimensionality of their Black experience and what that has brought to their work and how it will enrich our conversations around diaspora praxis under the pillars of dramaturgy and Blackness. So I'm gonna start with a little bit of biography. Okay. Let's begin with Stefan Martelly. Dr. Stefan Martelly was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Writer, poet, painter, and researcher, Martelly uses a transdisciplinary approach that unites theory, critical reflection, and creation. Her reflective approach moves through and with contemporary Haitian literature, creation, literary marginalities, as well as with the limits of interpretation. She is the author of the research creation essay, Les Jeux du Semblable. Excuse me, I totally butchered that, sorry. Madness, Margins in the Feminine and Contemporary Haitian Literature. Her most recent publications include the collection of poetry, Inventaire, and the illustrated poem book, L'Enfant Gazelle. I did read that, it's translated in English. It's her first translation in English, actually. It's a beautiful, it's intended for children, but really, who needs that category? And then she's finally, where her doctor thing really comes, is that she's the professor and research creation and research creation and Caribbean literature in the Department of Arts, Languages, and Literature at the University of Sherbrooke. Okay, so our other presenter is Funmi Adewole. And you know, we had this idea that maybe I would just sort of pick snippets from her biography and then she's gonna do something and we'll see what happens. But I felt like it's so important to acknowledge the amazing work when I was thinking about doing these biographies, that it's really important to make visible and give accolades to the work. And so I'm gonna take something from Funmi's website, and it's in the first person. So I'm not actually, obviously, her. Okay. I am dance researcher and storyteller. Choreography and communication are two of my favorite subjects. Perhaps they are one and the same thing. I am particularly interested in the theatrical dances and professional practices which draw on dance forms and aesthetics from Africa and the diaspora. The histories and stories told by dance produced for staging and presentation are philosophically, politically, socially, and aesthetically significant, and so are the stories we tell and the dances we dance in response. Funmi is also a doctor. Her interests in research are aesthetics in the Black Atlantic perspective, Black choreographers, contemporary dance from Africa versus African contemporary dance, African visual arts, dance, dramaturgy, choreography that draws on the African and diaspora dance forms. There's so much more. they're not, they're so much more than the sum of their parts. So hopefully we'll get to see a lot of that as we get into this our conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to these two fantastic presenters. And I guess I could just start with a kind of, I don't know, what should I ask a question, or do you want to just like dig in? What would you like to do?
Let's go.
Stefan has a poem.
I
Yeah,
do,
that's
but
right.
I can wait. I can
No,
wait if
let's
you
do
want
the
to go first.
poem. Let's do the poem. All right.
Okay. Let me, first of all, thank you very much for making this happen, Angelique. It's always a pleasure, you know, to have conversations with you, and then to be part of this wonderful project is an honor. I've started this poem by trying to write a bullet point presentation, short something to situate myself in this conversation. And the bulletproof presentation became a poem when I didn't want it really to happen. So there it is. It's called, the title is Perform Blackness, Blackness as Performance, Performative Blackness, a poem of refusal. I have great reluctance to the idea of blackness as performance. It evokes the pernicious idea of putting something of the self at a distance and then cloak oneself in it, like a dress or costume. It's the ideas that come into my head anyway. Performance eventually means recognizing a distance between the I and the self that maybe I'm unwilling to acknowledge as an act of self-preservation, as self-sovereignty. Why? Why should we consider it as performance? Something in some way more performative than other identities or the possibilities. I also very much like to resist the local dominant narratives, dominant here, of course, and not everywhere, of blackness as a vacant space, a place of pain, nothingness. The definition may be in North America, especially in Canada. Blackness as performance, either negative or positive, feels like an intimate divorce, a fissure of the self. In fact, this kind of separation fills me with terror. Reminds me very much so of zombification, two cells of the same cloth, separated to control and exploit, a self-mutilation rewarded by a false sense of belonging, an implied autophagia. As performance, do we become others within, ready to be consumed, starting with our feet, in order to distract us from the fact that our resistance to erasure has already become a self-devouration, le plat de résistance, making ourselves apparent to those who would erase us, only to become targets of our own secret contempt. I want my blackness to be so dissolved into myself, to the point where I don't even see it, to the point that I catch myself being Black. That if I catch myself being Black, it's only to know the joy and freedom of a homecoming, and to be so satisfied and profoundly happy that I am Black and free and not part of all this, that I smile at the thought and peto to myself and to the women who know me and say, see, did it again, Black. When I didn't even know I was doing it. Dress my children in blue and red again. Raise the son who only respects revolutionary battles, and a daughter who knows immediately her people when she sees them. Children who crave fruits that they never knew existed, who are right at home in rituals I never taught them. See, I knew and I did know, and I do know what it is like to be free. When dances are in me, these dances are in me as praxis is the movement of thought in life. And even my skin makes up each summer for all the lost melanin. My mother lives with me, and my babies know freedom, a deep freedom they have yet to experience completely. This might last a few generations, I hope. I think. Haiti. We are not gone yet. There is beauty in dying. We were taught to sing it. Mourir est beau. Only if the purpose of this death is more life, complete, is freedom. 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 Dear Funmi, to answer your letter, if I am a language, it is the one that poetry makes. Out of the languages that fabricate me, language never precedes the poem for a poet. Space is never empty, never. There is always something that was before. I hear that you are this beautiful embodiment of blackness against imperialist whiteness, and I honor this. I hear what you say about your diasporic Nigerian identity. To me, it is the same. Diaspora comes by physically leaving Haiti, although no one can leave Haiti completely. I don't understand it as a Pan-African diasporic experience rooted in slavery. I recognize my ancestors' continent, but Haiti is my ground zero. Dramaturgy as communication is maybe what we're doing today. To me, dramaturgy is what happens before the public performance, a space that can be usefully occupied by both critical and creative thought, by both creative and critical praxis. A place to wonder, what does this do really? Who am I who does it? And who is this for by necessity? And who is it destined to encounter by accident? I do hope you receive my poem that became a letter, and I hope to write again.
Thank you so much, Stéphane. That's lovely. I'm really struck by the repetition of the words freedom. And how many times it came back in your letter. And when you said that you want to be so comfortable with your blackness that it disappears. And I do think that part of the struggle within the discourse of blackness is sometimes the discourse can feel like a prison. Like, you know, in the dance world, you know, some dancers will say, I don't do black dance. I'm a black dancer, but not doing black dance, because in that moment they're arguing against feeling that the blackness has become a screen. So people only see their blackness and not other issues within what they're performing. And so there's that kind of debate of around blackness and wanting to say, don't consider what I'm doing to be black dance. So I'm talking about a debate that was quite strong in the 80s. I should locate it in time. You know, I think right now in Britain, people are very happy to say what they do is black dance. And I think that is post, you know, the trauma of Black Lives Matter last summer. People were like, yeah, black dance. When I arrived in England in the 90s, people were saying, I'm not doing black dance. I'm a black dancer, but I'm not doing black dance, because black dance had become representative of something. And they saw that something to be a prison that didn't allow them to express anything beyond certain ideas of what black was. So when you talk about this freedom, I sort of remember that kind of conversation.
Yeah, it's not to say that, it's not to negate the idea of blackness. My intent, I think, and maybe I want to be more precise about that. I think it's only that for me, and I think this is what I was trying to do with my poem, is that the black is always there. Sometimes it is silent, and sometimes I pronounce it, almost like the E in poetry in French, that sometimes you pronounce it and sometimes you don't pronounce it, but it's still there.
It's there.
Yeah, it's always there. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I think sometimes when protest takes place, you know, on the basis of blackness, like in an anti-racist protest, then the breakthroughs can happen at that time.
Yes.
But then certain aspects of it become to represent the whole of blackness. And I think then the next, can I say the next generation? The next generation start mitigating against the blackness, the idea of blackness that was formed by the previous, you know, the previous sense. So as you say, there's this, I find that there's this, I won't call it ambivalence, I will call it sort of public, there might be a public push to express blackness in a particular way during a particular time in response to particular issues. And then at another point, people look for the diversity in the blackness, let blackness just be there rather than be proclaimed, you know?
Yeah.
So there seems to be this historical waves of how, you know, blackness is represented and how Black people relate to the idea of blackness, you know? But I think in all of it, I think what you say about freedom is present. And I think when freedom gets choked, that's when, you know, you either proclaim blackness more or less. So I feel freedom is very central.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in all of what you described, the important idea is to understand that blackness does not always contain the same thing for everybody at the same time. I think there's a political idea of blackness that you mentioned that is very important, always very important, but that it is almost blackness as a way to resist negative ideas of blackness that are projected onto Black bodies and certain societies. And to me, it's very limitative in a way. And you have to, as soon as you can, go further into notions of self and identity that escape from these prisons of the dominant and Western societies, the dominant ideas of blackness. And you can find other ideas of blackness in other parts of the world, of course, that are more freeing.
You know, after I wrote you that letter,
Thank you for that. It was a wonderful letter.
You're welcome. And I said in it that when I went to university, I began to see blackness as being a discourse in opposition and myself as an embodiment of blackness against a imperialistic whiteness.
Yeah.
But after I'd written the letter, I thought, oh, there's something I should have also mentioned, that it became also a discourse in which we express solidarity with the African diaspora.
Yes.
Because it was a Black experience. And we used to think of, I think at the time, and I'm talking about 80s, in Nigeria, of Blackness being the Black experience. And that global, all-time Black experience that Black people from around the world could identify with in one way, one way or the other, whether that was through experiences of enslavement, colonization, migration, but also having been people of a variety of cultural and traditional backgrounds, heritages, which were still very valuable, you know, through time, and these heritages that continue to evolve, you know. And I remember at that time, in the 70s, we had this big festival in Nigeria called Festac. Festac 1977, and it was the festival of African and Black arts. And, you know, people from around the world came. It was like, you know, weeks of celebration and march past and displays of culture in Nigeria. People still debate and talk about Festac today. And it was called African and Black Cultures.
Interesting.
And I remember asking a lecturer of mine, why is it called African and Black Cultures? He said, oh, we're African and people of the diaspora are Black.
Black, yeah.
I said, okay, so that was one definition. Then I moved to England.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
So when I moved to England in the 90s, and I as soon as I got into England, I became Black British, you know. And then, so I was Black now. So I was thinking, okay, so Blackness has changed. So, and then I was speaking to a colleague who's from the Caribbean, and he said, well, yes, it's true. You're African, you're not Black. There's the only people in Africa who are Black are South Africans. So I said, why? He said, because they have experienced apartheid. And therefore, there's a dominant whiteness they're dealing with, which you in Nigeria are not dealing with that. So I thought, okay. So I began to realize that the idea of Blackness was varied, and it changed from location from one location, geographical location, to another, and changed also from experiences of different types of oppression, you know, whether you felt it was Blackness or not. And so I began to see, from that, I began to see Blackness as a discourse. I began to see more as a discourse in which there are continual conversations about these things, and not from one perspective. I suppose because I sort of live in Britain, and I still have very strong links to Nigeria. I have family there, so I travel, and I work in Africa and in Europe. Because of this, I suppose I see it as a discourse. And then, so when I go into a place, I think, what's the conversation? What's the discourse about Blackness here? Rather than, because at one point it was like, oh, is this Blackness? Is that Blackness? Is it, you know? So now I just see it as this holistic discussion.
It is. It is. What's interesting, I'm very fascinated by what you have to say, because part of it is because Nigeria is one of the places that I long to visit one day. But from the Haitian perspective, I think, strangely enough, Haitians would say almost the same thing and define themselves as Haitian first, and not Black second, as Haitian first, and Haitian being the same thing as Black. You see, it's a complex identity, because in a way it doesn't perceive itself as a diasporic identity. It perceives itself as the last, almost like Creole is considered as the last of African languages that emerged on this continent. But Haiti considers itself as, like I said in my poem, ground zero, like the Black nation that emerged at a time where it was almost inconceivable for Black nation to exist. And the imperial constitution, I'm sorry, I don't have this information handy on me, and Haitians in the public will not be happy that I don't have this quote at hand, but there's an imperial constitution that was promulgated after the independence that specifically says that since the children of the same father cannot have different ethnicities, all Haitians are considered as Black. It's as the letter of the law. You know, this is happening in 1806. So the convergence of Haitian and Black identities is very, very complete in a way.
Wow. I was going to ask you actually a question around diaspora in relation to that. Yeah. Because I met a choreographer from Guadeloupe, Lina Bleu, amazing choreographer, and we were in a residency in Senegal together.
Yeah.
And we were all talking about the African diaspora, the African diaspora, the African diaspora. And she said, it's a bit more complex than that in Guadeloupe, because we have so many history with the French, with the Spanish, with the Dutch, that it belongs to a diaspora, but is it only African? And we all went silent. We didn't really know how to.
I'm sure you were. Sure you did.
Yeah, we looked at her dark, her black skin.
Yes, yes.
We thought, of course, you're the African diaspora.
Yeah,
but again, she wanted us to stop making assumptions. So they want that the African diaspora is one experience also.
Okay.
And so we all had to stop. And the question I wanted to ask you was about the sense of diaspora in Haiti. I know that Guadeloupe is not Haiti, but because it's in the Caribbean, I was thinking, is it similar? Is it the idea that the diaspora is a more complex, and it doesn't only revolve around Africa as being, like the origin or the motherland, but there's more, complex?
Well, this is a very interesting question. I don't know why she said that or what she meant by that, but if you're referring to the multiple origins of Caribbean nations, of course she's right. Caribbean nations are a mix of a few different ethnicities and cultures, and this is true. But the Haitian context is very different than the Guadeloupean context, if only for the reason that we're an independent nation, and that Guadeloupe is still a French territory. So you're still in France when you're in Guadeloupe. You have to know this, even though there is a specific Guadeloupe and Martinican identity that is different, of course, from the French one, but politically it's not the same situation at all. And even though Haitians, and I think it's the brilliance of the article of the Constitution that somebody actually put in reference for me in the chat. I knew it that Haitians were there. Okay. The brilliance of that article is to say that even though we are from multiple origins, our definition is blackness. So the relationship between Haiti and Africa, for instance, is a relationship of acknowledgement as our fundamental cultural affiliation in a way. And this is not negated by all the other influences, including indigenous influences that are within a Haitian culture. Mm-hmm. It's not a contradiction for us to say that, both things. So if I can maybe try to give a clearer answer, it's not a contradiction for Haitians to say that we do have these multiple connections, but we are still completely Haitian and completely Black.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say, I don't think I'm quoting Lena Blue correctly. I think the point I'm trying to make is she was trying to make us understand that the concept of diaspora was not as
and the concept.
Everywhere, everybody in the diaspora. Because sometimes we think that every person who says I'm of the African diaspora has the same experience as people, African Americans, or we might think they all have the same. Yeah, I think she was trying to make us understand that it's a very, very varied
different
experience.
Yes. And to answer, because I had forgotten about the diaspora part of your question, to answer that part of the question, when I read in your letter that you were Nigerians, when they said diaspora meant actually people living outside of Nigeria, either in voluntary or forced exile, Haitians have the same definition. Okay. Diaspora for Haitians is Haitians living outside of Haiti. This is the ground meaning of it.
Yeah.
And then outside of that, there is this connection with Africa. But I don't think that Haitians see themselves really as a diasporic people. Haitians that live in Haiti.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
It changes another layer.
It is another layer. It makes Blackness and diaspora both very complex
I guess.
and
Yeah.
multi-layered.
Yeah.
And I would say, there's one, we talk a lot about identity as Black people, but we don't talk as much about subjectivity. And it's something that, and this relates to praxis for me, because subjectivity, how do you see yourself, your perspectives, positionality. And I think it's something that praxis allows us to engage with.
Absolutely.
And often, because the idea of Blackness turns up a lot in areas of protest, I think of revolution and resistance, that sometimes the idea of Blackness around these issues and diaspora around the issue of what we're talking about, our multi-dimensionality, the layeredness, is sometimes not given enough room. I remember, and I think that's what praxis opened up for me, the ability there to be Black and not whatever the dominant idea of what Black should be at that time. And I could be Black and not that, you know what I mean? With in the acknowledgement of praxis. I also wanted to ask, when I began to see how many art forms you engage in. At first, when I read that you were transdisciplinary, I thought, oh, that means she makes an artwork and it has different art, maybe she does drama or theater and she uses different art forms. But I actually began to see that you actually operate in a variety, almost like a multimodal situation, like switching from poetry to painting, which I understand because I do a bit of that. And I wanted to say, how did you arrive at this? How did you, what was it? And in terms of praxis, do you consider it as doing the same would your visual art is emerging from the same place as your poetry, or are there different sets of concepts that you are investigating, in the different art forms?
Well, thank you for that question, and I hope you follow my answer with a description of your practice, because I've been wanting to ask the same question to you. Actually, I think I know that the reason why I wrote the poem in part was to answer the question of praxis by doing something.
Yeah.
To me, the poem that I read at the beginning was my embodiment, if we can call a poem embodiment, which I would, of my practice, of my ideas around praxis. So this is the very reason why I wrote a poem, and to go further on that idea is that at first I would tell you that the writing came first. I've been writing forever, meaning I started I was 8, I think. And then the painting came after, because there was something that I needed to do that I couldn't do with the writing. So it was to complete the same urgency, but with another language. And my theoretical work, to me, is also another language that I use. But by the time that I wrote my essay, my latest essay, it all became one thing to me. And I do not differentiate any longer between these different activities as things that are really separate. They never were, truly. But now, things happen, like I can start writing something that I think about as a presentation, and then it becomes a poem. And I'm not trying to control this process anymore. I'm really trying to push this as far as I can push it. to see how I can question the ideas around thought, practice, and visual arts and writing in a way that pushes them further and further.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So for example, in my latest essay, there are paintings included, but to me, these paintings are ideas that are connected to the essayistic voice inside the essay. You see?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, to answer your question, I
Yes.
would say, I would say my artistic practice, I'm a storyteller. And it's only now that I will say I'm sort of stepping out as an independent artist. I actually started off as a journalist. In Nigeria, I did a degree in languages, and I worked as an arts journalist. So I used to interview artists for newspapers in Nigeria, and I was living in Lagos, and I did some associate producing, creating inserts for newspapers. I was also a radio actress. And then when I moved to England, that's when I thought, oh, new country, can try a new thing. And I'd realized I'd picked up enough dancing in the university by taking part in taking some courses and also taking part in some productions to audition and get work. So that started a sort of 10-year performance career. So I wasn't formally trained in that sort of direct way. I'll do a show, take master classes, think about what I had just learned, analyze it, break that down, use it in the rehearsal process for the next piece of work. So that's how I sort of developed as a performer. And I did a lot of sort of dance drama, physical theatre, which is sort of like a mixture of acting and dance. I only did one contemporary dance company, which was a tough year. I managed to give some good performances, but because I hadn't been trained in any kind of Western modern dance technique, it was quite tough to work there. But I also learned a lot because I tend to investigate everything I do. Why couldn't I do that movement? It's not because the movement wasn't difficult, for example. What was different, what I found was that they had a different sense of rhythm to me. They related to music different to me. So it was that kind of things that made dancing difficult. The actual technical thing, I could do it. But it was, and
I get it.
Yeah, and the sense of expression. My face was too mobile and too. I had to then perform a certain kind of facial expression to fit in, and there was all sorts of other things that made me understand something about performativity, but also that a genre is not simply about technical movement. There's a whole sense of what is being performed and what values are being performed that I had to learn. So I realized that when I was performing, I was writing for a newsletter about dance because I had this journalistic background, and I wanted to understand the story of African-based performance in Europe. What was it? Because we were always arguing, what is African dance? What is African dance? And that writing about dance in this journalistic way is what sort of led me into a PhD.
Yes, because you were forced to explain everything.
Yes. So actually, and then I became a dramaturg because dancers began to realize I could look at their work from different angles and sort of help them express what they were trying to do, help them find the generic or symbolic language they needed, or help them break stereotypes. How could they find a way to get through or past or shatter the stereotype they felt the audience is bringing to
the room before even they started?
But when I look at all of this, I find it was driven really by everything. The journalism, the performance, the academic work has always been driven by the desire to try and tell a story. of how do we express ourselves in this multiplicity of culture.
That's
and
very
language.
interesting.
Yeah, I think the big issue was that my mother, she grew up in a very different life to me. My mother, she's passed now, may she rest in peace. She was a princess. She grew up. Her grandfather was the king of Ife. Her father was a prince. She used to go to school on a horse, which was, very in the 40s. That was a big thing. Her, and then, she was one of the first generation of women to go to Western education. So she trained as a teacher, which was huge in the 40s and 50s, then. And I used to wonder why me and her struggled in communication. We sort of didn't understand each other. She spoke English very well. She lived in England for 17 years. And I began to realize we had a completely different upbringing. I mean, her father had 30 wives. She grew up in a compound with 30 wives. Her mother was the fifth. Her mother was a Muslim. Her father was a Christian, although still very involved in traditional religion. So she moved between three religions. She grew up in a highly polygamous. She was the first generation to be monogamous, and then one of the first to go to Europe. So I was born in London and grew up on a council estate, and our reference points were so, so different that we would use the same English word and would mean completely different things.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of experience and all of this coming together, I kept on trying to understand and explain what's the background of this and what are we trying to say here. I've been in so many rooms where people are fighting with each other because they're using the same words, but the words
it doesn't mean
And that's why I say I was a great interpreter when I was a performer for other people. They would ask me, we want you to be an old woman, and I would study it and I'd be an old woman. But when I wanted to start making independent work for myself, I really now struggled.
Yes, of course, because you never occupied that space.
I never occupied the space. And it's only now. And what I do now,
you're catching up with yourself.
I'm catching up with myself. And what I do now is I perform as a storyteller, and I have different characters. And one of my characters wanders around like a homeless woman and with a basket and a trolley. And you can pick an object from the trolley and I will tell you the story of the object.
That's beautiful.
So, things like that. I have another character who tells folk tales, but she's a city woman who tells folk tales about tortoises and speaking tortoises and, birds that climb trees and things like that. But she's a city woman. She has all these city mannerisms, telling all these folk tales and what the folk tales mean to her, somebody from an urban African context. So I that's sort of what my artistic practice is, I
have so much to say. First of all, I want to acknowledge that you come from royalty.
No, I would say my mother did. I would say when I go to my hometown, they, people come out to me, and I'm like, oh,
of course, that's normal. And second of all, I want to talk about the two things that you pointed out about, storytelling and dancing being your languages. It's really interesting to me because there's almost a contradiction here for me, because I think, although I write, strangely enough, I write stories sometimes, not often, but sometimes. I don't consider myself really a storyteller at all. And dancing is probably one of the rare arts I never tried to practice professionally ever. It's not that I don't like it. I don't like to dance, but to me, it's something that is on another sphere and that I would never want to make it a professional activity ever. So it's really fascinating to me. But when I was thinking about this, actually, because I knew I was going to speak with Angélique and with yourself who practice dance, and I think that one of the reasons is the fact that my main language is poetry always. Everything becomes poetry at the end, and that my writing is all the movement and desires sometimes that my body does not execute, doesn't need to execute, because it's already in the writing. The writing to me is my dance, in a way. Yeah. So in that way, my writing is almost an accomplished movement, physical movement.
Yeah.
And also on sometimes I could define it by it being the potentiality of movement that it doesn't need to be actualized because it's already in the writing. So that's interesting to me, that in this way we might be on polar opposite sides, and not really, but yeah.
It's interesting what we choose to translate what we want to communicate through. The choice of translating movement through words, as opposed to translating movement through dance, if you want to say movement and dance being two different things.
Yeah. I don't know why I would separate the two. Yeah, and this is true to the point where when I write very intense pieces, I physically hurt, as if I was, doing active movement. Yeah. So this is the way it is for me.
It is. I think there's an emotional connection that exists in all these activities, and all the activities use the body. I mean, even if it's picking up the pen to put it on the paper, and then you're thinking of words, you're thinking in rhythm and cadence,
Well, specifically in poetry, rhythm is very, very important. Yeah,
and the idea of the imagery in a poem, I think all of these are they are embodied activities, whether or not that you're using a full body movement or not, and that's what I discovered dancing with a contemporary dance company. As I said, I come from dance drama, or some people call physical theatre. When I danced with a contemporary dance company, what I began to understand was the shift in the state of mind required to perform certain, you have to have, it's not simply about the body being technically able to do it, but you have to have a right attitude or mindset to do it. And I became more aware. If not, you give off the wrong quality of movement, and you give off the wrong aesthetic. So sorry to interrupt, but was it this idea behind the fact that you, for instance, were told that you should not emote so much? But I also experienced this when doing African dance styles.
Okay.
That's why you'll see a sort of different personality in the performance of dancehall to a different personality in the performance of salsa.
Yeah.
There's a different performativity, even a performativity of gender. I mean,
yes, absolutely.
B girls, I think B girls are very feminine and beautiful and all this, but their femininity is very different from a salsa femininity, for example.
So
there's always, but I became more conscious of all of this and began to therefore see that there is a sort of, the mindset also is very much involved in any kind of creative expression, as you would do in writing, because I write poetry as well.
You do?
Yeah, I do write poetry. I don't make so much noise about it, but I don't know whether my poems are good.
I'm outing you today.
I might send you a book, but hey ho, be nice.
Do so, please. Yeah.
Be nice. So yeah, so I think yes, and all that is part of embodiment, isn't it? The mind body relating.
Yeah.
Expression. So I can completely understand when you say that you dance through writing.
I think I do.
Yeah.
I'm becoming more and more aware that is the case.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise it seems that a pretty sedentary and very solitary activity, but I don't feel that it is for me. Truly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's not it at all. Yeah. And going back to dramaturgy, there's something I also wanted to mention is about the practice that I could consider myself doing as a dramaturgy is it's really been an accident for me, because I think the way that I came into this world where I could collaborate with wonderful people like Angélique is is that I observed failed dramaturgies, what I consider arrogantly maybe as failed dramaturgies, and trying to think about why this project that was, that declared so many good intentions went really, really, really wrong.
Yeah.
And I wrote a few pieces about that I do not consider really as criticism pieces, even though they are, but I really consider them a way for me to resolve creatively and critically this contradiction of a work that affirms itself to be something, but then does something completely different. Almost polar opposite of what it declares to be those things.
Yeah.
So this idea really got me going into that world of representation and theater and dramaturgy. Yeah.
Funny enough, it was failure that also brought me into dramaturgy. I did. I made a piece. This must have been something like 12. I made a solo, and it was basically me playing children's games on stage. It was a 15-minute, 20-minute piece. I was playing lots of children's games, and I had poetry, and I did it at a physical theatre festival. And they loved it. There was a woman there called Kiki Gale. She was in the audience. She's a contemporary dance promoter, and she just loved the piece. And she said, "Oh, I have a contemporary dance festival. You come and show it in my contemporary dance festival." And I went there, and they hated it. Funny enough, there were certain people in the audience actually liked it, but they were not the artists. It was like I was seeing my friends who were dancers who sort of like were being polite to me, but I could see in their eyes saying, "Funmi, what was that?" And then what? Why did you do this? And then their mum or their, would say, "That was a great piece. I used to dance. I used to play that game when I was young as well." So I found that everybody who was not an artist in the room liked the piece, and all the artists were sort of like.
Do you know why? Why exactly?
Well, there was a number of things. One, when I first performed it, where it was first seen, was a physical theatre festival. And so the audience came with certain assumptions. They were fine watching, this woman running around with almost no technique as a dancer, doing children's games and saying poetry. And they were running around in a circle and then playing clapping games and grandma's footsteps and things like that. They were happy. In the dance festival, I came after a ballet company. Which was the worst. I don't know why in fact, the programmer told me later that, she said, "Very sorry, I programmed you like that, because this real technical company in Britain called Ballet Black, they just gone off stage. And then I came in, just just running around and, So one, it was where I was seen, even though those two venues are not very far apart, And then it was a situation that made me very aware about place
Yes,
where the
yes,
performance
yes.
takes
I was
place.
going to say, yeah.
And that people
yeah.
come to the theatre with a history of
Of course,
performance and
of course.
expectation,
Yes,
you know,
whatever you
and
do, it's always in context of their
it's always in a
of
context.
their cultural baggage and cultural perceptions.
Yeah. And then it's the form of articulation. So the Contemporary Dance Festival was called Global Local. And so everybody in the festival was doing some kind of hybrid work, mixed in different cultures. But as Stuart Hall would say, an articulation is where you might bring two elements together, which would not normally, you might not normally put a Shakespeare sonnet with somebody playing djembe drums. You might bring this kind of connection in order to make a statement. So there was a lot of that happening, but my articulation did not go down well because it was not in the artistic framework that I
wouldn't consider that a failure, really. But
well, I was there licking my wounds because no one wanted to drink with me at the bar. But one choreographer who did very well on that night came over and said, "Can I speak to you later?" And I said, "Okay, fine." So later she said, "Oh, I'm doing a piece and I'd like you to be my dramaturg." I was like, "Why?" She said, "Your piece tells me you can help me. You can support my process." I said, "But my piece, everybody thought my piece was horrendous." Oh, she said, "Well, there was certain things you could have done. You could have had a better costume, a bit more like, she said sort of about packaging it. But she said, I can tell from your piece that you can help me support my process. I need an outside eye." And that is where my career as a dramaturg started, from the sort of unpacking my failure and sort of unpacking my failure. And then because what she could see was that she wanted to do a piece that mixed character-based work with dance and abstract dance, and also bringing games and different things. She needed someone that could help her make sure it was not a mess, that it was too
coherent.
Cohesive. So that's where so this idea of failure, well, someone told me we keep everything we try, it fails and fails until it succeeds. So
Well, I could bring in right now, maybe, I don't know how much time we have left, and we should at some point have let the other people speak, but it reminds me of the idea. Okay. It reminds me of the idea of the catastrophe in my theoretical work, because I work a lot around this idea as somewhat of a starting point almost for creative work, for all creative work. And this comes from my analysis of literary works of contemporary Haitian literature, and finding that in those works there was always an element of not simply failure, but of unaccomplished works, meaning that in this novel they were poets that were characters, but we could never read their poetry. Or there is in this other novel, there's a character that doesn't speak. But always, in every case, the book itself, the structure of the book itself, relied on these non-speaking or impossible, creations that propelled the one that was possible forward. So I like to work with these dichotomies. So I'm very touched by your story.
It's taken, I would say, so as a dramaturg, I think I've done well, but as a performer, I think I'm just becoming into my own. I mean, as an independent performer, I was always happy being directed, but that's taken a longer time to sort of achieve. So I would say there was one question, I think, in one of Dana's provocations is, do you see practice and praxis as two different things? And I guess I do. I think I see practice, I think of practice very much almost like a professional practice, and what genre, what group of people, what audience, what, I'm working in a university, the curriculum, I think about and developing maybe a methodology or a way of working in that environment, which I feel is effective and ethical and whatnot. But praxis, more like the conceptual universe that I am investigating, and which I'm investigating generally for a period of time, and that is it's sort of an internal conceptual map, which allows me to look at different situations and ask questions of them. So that's how I sort of see the difference. And I see that my practice has sort of emerged out of my life, lived experience. It's come out of the changes, I guess, I want to see, I want to contribute to happening. And that terrain, that terrain is the terrain, I would say, of post-independent Africa, where we are looking at living our lives in terms of institutions through a very complex institutional framework. Like, as I say, my grandfather being a chief and my mother going home from Lagos. In Lagos, she was the head of the catering service at the national television, very urban woman, and then going home for the festivals with her father, and not actually wanting her children to be part of that, because she said it would be she said it would be a confusion for us. And she was very clear, this is urban Lagos, this is where I want you to, live. I don't want you to come into the politics of the hometown and the palace and that. So I think learning, being aware of this complexity as well, and also knowing that I was Nigerian but also British. And my mother really wanted me to preserve my British accent. She said, this accent will open doors for you. And, to the point that sometimes she'd even want to me to speak Yoruba in the house. And as much as I was angry with her, she was correct. I would turn up at people's offices, they would hear my accent, and they'll make all kinds of assumptions. She must be rich. She must be, her father must be a diplomat, all of which was not true, but, And so I think that those interconnected institutions, some thousands of years old, some adopted during colonialism, and then after colonialism, let's say, how do we make the African university? How do we make the civil service African? Do we do a federal form of government, or do we do a parliamentary? And all of these things of how do we absorb and take control of these institutions and make them our own? How do we indigenize them? I think these are the questions that I think I grappled with and constitute, I think, my praxis. I mean, I take my definition of praxis from Fiera, to reflect, to transform.
Well, maybe I'll close on this for my part, but I think really what I tried to show today and some of the times is really that there is no longer a difference for me, a profound difference between my practice and praxis. To me, it's all the same activity of wondering and figuring out what I can understand and articulate, more than understand, articulate from these different realities, moving from a Black majority space to a minority space, being a minority in another space, and moving from a place that is truly post-colonial in a way, anti-colonial and post-colonial, to a colonial space like Canada. and navigating all these different spaces in the best way that I can find, but also trying to find articulations that better represent the agitation of my mind. All of this is really happening at the same time, consecutively, all at once, in my different activities. And to me, there is no longer a difference between my creative work and my theoretical work. To me, it's truly becoming the same thing. And I'm very, very happy to move in that direction. Also, and and keeping in mind the idea of praxis as a way to transform the world. That's a very Marxist.
Yeah.
That's a very Marxist idea around praxis, but still, I think there's some truth to that idea of doing something transformative with creative activity and theoretical activity. That really is very seducing to my mind and body.
Thank you.
Thank you, Funmi. It was great. Thank you.
Yes,
To you.
lovely chatting. Really nice. Thank you.
So sorry, I'm just going to butt in here.
Hi.
Thank you so much. That was so generous, and it's so great to be the fly on the wall with that. We have somebody who's raising their hand. So I guess what we're going to do now is kind of open up to the question and answer. And we'll just, Nadine, is your hand up that you want to ask a question, or?
Oh, I didn't have a question. It was a comment. If folks have questions, I'll let them go ahead.
No.
Hi, Nadine.
Anything is fine.
Hi, Stefan. Thank you so much, Funmi, for participating in this conversation. Thank you for space and everyone else involved in making this happen. There's volumes I could say on this topic. So I had to go back and go to the two key words of praxis and diaspora. And just to add on what Stéphane has expressed so many times in this conversation around Haiti and Haitians considering ourselves the ground zero. Okay. I was explaining to a group of people earlier this week that Haiti is diasporic African praxis. It's like a concrete and tangible example of African praxis of being in diaspora, because Haiti, above and beyond being the success of a 13 long years revolutionary war to abolish slavery and claim a territory in the name of the people who were considered non-beings on that same space, it was possible through the deliberate and intentional and political federation of the African diasporic peoples who were in that space, and that intentionality is expressed throughout our society in the literal federation of different traditional African religions underneath Vodou, because Vodou is not one single religion, but it's actually a federation of different religious practices, whether it be Yoruba, Agada, Congo, Igbo, etc. And people refer to Vodou as being the federation of 21 nations. So the Pan-Africanism that humanity will see emerge throughout the 20th century was actually the foundational praxis of Haiti as we know it. And yes, we consider ourselves, and one of the reasons why we don't consider ourselves a diaspora is because of that. And one of the reasons why Haiti and Haitians can consider ourselves a ground zero, I always recognize as a reflection of how continental Africans often are able to put themselves at the center of the conversation, at the center of the perspective, and still integrate whatever else is happening in the world without pushing themselves off kilter. And for decades, I would joke to my Nigerian friends that Haiti is a micro Nigeria in the Caribbean. And it's something that people who don't know Haitians well or Nigerians well can't see off the top of their heads. But there was this interview between Zadie Smith and Chimamanda Adichie, where she was like, why are you Nigerians always on top of the world? How do you guys do it? Like, whenever you see, like, a Nigerian is never simply one thing. They're always, you know, an engineer, a doctor, a priest, a chief, etc. and whatnot. You know, it's all that. And I'm like, oh, this is Haitians. This is Haitians on a different scale, you know. And one of the reasons we achieve that bedrock sense of self and position in the world is because our ancestors transmitted that sense of anchoring and sense of self. And the rare times in Haitian history where a Haitian became more connected to this idea of being a dispersed body, it was an interesting reversal of the self. There's a little known historical figure called Benito Sylvain, who was from a family of thinkers and leaders, originally from Northern Haiti. I have to shout out Cap-Haïtien, where my family's rooted. Originally from Northern Haiti, and who as a young adult left Haiti to study in France. And his early texts were abominations, where he called on continued expansion of European empire in Africa, to bring a civilizing light, etc., whatnot. But then he went to Africa and he spoke to Africans, and he saw the actual truth and reality of what a Western empire was on the continent. And he performed a complete 180 and became one of the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism as we know it today. And he migrated to Ethiopia, and he became the second-hand man of Ethiopian statesmen there, and he participated in putting together the first Pan-Africanist Congress of 1900, etc., whatnot. So what's interesting is that Haitians get this sense of being a diaspora when we're confronted with whiteness. When we're
in this sense, it corresponds to the idea of linking diaspora to the experience of the transatlantic and, you know, literally white supremacy. Yeah. Except,
but when we're home, we're home, Africans of the Americas.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't hear you. You're muted.
Yeah. I'm muted myself.
I'll let somebody else comment or question or whatever.
Yeah. Thank you for this, Nadine. I just want to point out that this very interesting answer was also a way for you to shout out Cap-Haïtien again, but the Northern Haitians. Yeah.
Oh wait, one little anecdote.
No, somebody else has to speak.
Oh, somebody has a hand. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll add the anecdote.
Sorry.
Thanks,
yes,
Nadine.
Yes, thank you so much for that. We have another hand up. Tyler, go ahead.
All the buttons are working. Yeah, I also have not quite a question, but as someone who's very interested in epistemology and communications and format and such, was really interested in the presentation of this whole encounter as just, oh yeah, let's just sit in on your conversation with each other, as opposed to it being more of a lecture format. And there was some talk at the beginning about, like, with blackness, the tension between, like, oh, well, we want to define it this way, but then we have to react against how the previous generation did that and such. And what I found in my own personal affective reflections on listening to your conversation is that whether the topic was blackness, dramaturgy, praxis, encountering them obliquely through just your personal experiences rather than a more focused discussion like a TED Talk would be, or not a discussion, but a more focused lecture like a TED Talk, helped me to consider those topics as the whole of a Venn diagram rather than just the overlap. So when I think of, okay, so what does dramaturgy mean? It is comprised of the collective experiences between you two and your full multiple praxes rather than just, oh, well, where do they overlap? And that must be the core of it. And that was, it's been an interesting shift in framework or shift in perspective for me over the course of the past hour that I'd be curious if that resonates at all.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Tyler. I think that is the ingenuity of Angelique and her team to curate this event in this way around conversations, because it does. I mean, I remember sending an email to Dana today saying, are you expecting a 30-minute presentation? Because I'm so used to giving 30-minute presentations. So, and of course, no one ever mentioned anywhere in this process that there was going to be a presentation.
Yeah.
So I do think yes, I would, it's just the genius of the team to curate it in this way so that we approach the topics, you know, differently.
And discussion, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And for my part, I have to say that in lining with my questioning around epistemologies and around, you know, theoretical work and practice, I more and more participate and build these platforms in conversation. Right? This is one of my preferred ways to have discussions and to think about issues that are, you know, that do not need to be resolved at the end like a beautifully packaged thing, but that are more interesting if they keep evolving throughout what is happening and after the you know, this moment that we share together.
I love that idea of it not having to resolve and be packaged by the end of the meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And about epistemology, I'd like to say that one thing we haven't done much of in Nigeria is document the development of how we've worked with Western frameworks and absorbed them. So, for example, television or the idea of the civil service. We haven't really written many histories about what is the Nigerian civil service. But what I began to find is that there were lots of what someone has called epistemic conversations, where people have started to develop an epistemology of how that institution has developed through conversations, and some of them have been documented. And then we start getting what the thinking and the discourse of that is. And a lot of it has been conversations, but where conversation is overlooked, then it looks like no one theorized anything about, you know, no one theorized anything in that area, which is not true. They just didn't do it in an academic fashion. They did it through conversations and practice, everyday practice.
But what the fact is that we get to define what is academic at some point. And I've been encouraging my students, both PhD students, you know, writing their thesis, and my students, you know, coming into conversations that I curate in other spaces, to not be afraid, for example, to quote conversations as documents. If they have to write an article, if they have to write a piece, you can quote, and you should definitely quote Black women when they speak, because this is not only a shared knowledge, a moment of shared knowledge, but it's also a moment of building knowledge together that is very interesting. And why the fact that we don't consider this as a document that's legitimate enough to quote is something that goes to colonialism and patriarchy, and we should not do that anymore.
Welcome to the Undercommons. I so appreciate so many of what you're saying, and I know that Matthew has his hand up. And Nadine, do you have your hand up still? Just curious. Anyways, if it's not, take it down. Otherwise, you can keep it up. But I just wanted to say that one of the important things about this is that the traces that we're building, and I know that Stefan, you come from the oral history and like how, and I know that you have a lot of work as well, Funmi, in this idea of creating these structures that aren't within the white or colonial context, right? It's this whole idea of moving away from the master's tools and like creating your own ways of working with that have this sort of Afrocentric, diasporic, Black Atlantic, Pan-African, yeah. Anyways, I'm gonna go ahead and, oh, okay, sorry. I have a hard time doing this multitasking thing sometimes. Okay, sorry. Matthew, thank you.
Like, pass to me. Hi, thank you both so much for an incredibly rich conversation. I think, going to have the privilege of transcribing this afterward, and so I get to revisit in depth again. I wanted to respond a little bit to, and maybe give a bit of a preview of where this conversation series is moving, and I think the comment that Tyler made and your responses to it about a choice of format which eschews a certain normative presentational frontality is something that has been very strategic for us. And in a sense, that sort of speaks to the intersections of diasporic Black study, of research creation, or as you might know it, Funmi, arts-based research, and of the fact that we're moving between language and movement in building a vocabulary of dramaturgy and Blackness as an intersection of concepts. And so one of the things that ABCs of DE, this conversation series, is attempting to do is build a vocabulary of movement, as we're calling it, a vocabulando, which is not something that's contained either in vocabulary or in movement, but is something that's sort of transversal between the two of them, as in a sense, a really dramaturgical practice, but also a practice, again, of diasporic knowledge-making, non-Western knowledge-making practices. And, I think that's a pretty established conversation in performance studies, moving beyond an archival practice towards one of activating a repertoire. And one of the things that we hope to be able to do, and I think you both know this, that we've recently been successful in a new granting suite application. And one of the objects that we have in these conversations is hopefully being able to return to you, to this conversation, as well as to the other conversations that we've had, by gathering again. So, again, there's a repertoire that's being activated here, where there's a moving through these conversations and a building of a vocabulary of movement that doesn't just do these sort of one-off things that, and when we invited you to initially participate in this conversation, we talked about the fact that what we were looking for was something that wasn't a sort of a pre-canned lecture, because we knew that you'd have a lot to say to each other. Angelique knew in particular because she knew your practices the best and knows you both. So again, not a question, but just to add to the conversation, and also to express my appreciation for your time.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. Nadine, did you want to say something?
Yes, very quickly.
Okay.
Because of the way I was raised, on top of being Haitian, praxis for me will always be a question of power, because I mean, my parents are communists. So for me, praxis is that word that Marx used all the time about how you put your theories into the real embodied world and change power and change relationships, and put an end to exploitation and marginalization. And so to go back to that notion, that idea for me that Haiti's sovereignty is the result of African diasporic praxis. And one of the manifestations of the success of that initiative, as Stéphane says, Haitians putting themselves always as ground zero or the center point. My favorite anecdote about that is how one year I was talking to a good friend of mine and saying that I'm very proud, I'm very happy that Haitians have a very solid sense of pride. I feel that sometimes we may take it a little too far. And she countered by saying, of course not. I mean, you guys, you felt Napoleon, first Black Republic in history, the only successful slave revolt in human history, blah, blah, blah. And that very evening, I was going to a soirée, used to be a regular event organized by Maggie Mitellus, one of our key pillars of Haitian cultural society here in Montreal. And it was at Salon d'Aomi, which is the venue that used to host it. So for anyone who knows African history, Dahomey is pretty significant in West African history and in Haitian history. And they used to have a little table at the entrance where they'd put books and newspapers and newsletters that came from Haitian organizations from across Haiti and the diaspora. And there was this one community newsletter. It was like a community newspaper, maybe a monthly, that was produced by a media outlet based out of Paris, Haitians in Paris, which is the worst place for Haitians to be because you're back in the belly of the imperial beast, for which like you slaughtered so many people to be free of these people, and there you are, you're back. And of all places, for a Haitian person to stand in a position of humility, you know, with their tails tucked between their legs, you know, and you just try to be kind of quiet and discreet, you know. And the newspaper was called something like the Haitian Community Newspaper. And it had a byline, much like, you know, the New York Times has all the news that's fit to print. And their byline was Haïti, le pays où tout a commencé. Haiti, the country where it all began. And I was like, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. And for me, again, it's about the success of these Africans 2 generations later, 200 years later, 10 generations later, you know, their descendants, you know, we achieved sovereignty, but we're still getting beaten up and pilloried by, you know, Western imperialism. We're still getting beaten up and pilloried by fascism that has driven us to the 4 corners of the planet, to the point that we end up at the foot of as the same people who had, you know, enslaved our ancestors. And yet we can still say we are the beginning of history.
No matters. No matters at all. Haitian.
That was my anecdote.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good one.
Thank you, Nadine.
Thank you so much for sharing, Nadine. Is there anyone else who has any more questions that they'd like to ask? Keeping it open? No? Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up. But before we go, we wanted to, sorry, I'm just going to read this off the chat. We'd like to invite you all to the next Dramaturgical Ecologies conversation on April 7th, 2 to 4 p.m. Third iteration with guest Daniel McNeil, Queen's University, and Jamila Johnson Small, Seraphine 1369, artist and dancer from the UK. Daniel McNeil shares his scholarly engagement with multiculturalism and its normalizing impulse, and Jamila Johnson Small, Seraphine 136, reflects on the practice as an artist and dance maker interested in the construction of performative environments which challenge and make identities. And the key words for that is going to be friction and opacity.
Good one.
Any last comments before we go? Well, I would, sorry, is there something else? Hold on.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thanks to Angelique. I know she's left, but thank you. And thanks to all the team, Dana, thank you. And Stefan, thank you so much. It's been a brilliant conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Funmi. It was really a very nice conversation with you, and I hope that we keep it going in some way. Thank you to everybody else and to the team, and of course, much love to Angelique, and we'll keep an eye on the proceedings of these discussions.
Thank you so much.
Okay, wait, I gotta say thank you officially. I never know when to interject, so I don't know. But once again, I'm gonna just echo all of the chat and my fellow colleagues here. And yes, Angelique had to leave, and she's very disappointed but you know, she's a busy lady doing important things. But thank you so much for your generosity and going on this little adventure with us and putting up with me. And I look forward to, as Matthew said, we're going to be having other events being held that we're hoping to welcome everybody back, or we're intending to welcome everybody back, and hopefully in person to revisit what comes from these conversations and this vocabulando. Yes, thank you. Do you have anything you want to say, Anna?
No, I'm just hanging out here. You know, I do want to just remind folks that we did stream this conversation, which also means that it's recorded. There's been so many great ideas that were shared with us here today. So if you and your colleagues and friends were not able to attend, please do feel free to share that link with them so they could revisit this moment of a generous exchange that we witnessed here today. Thank you all very much for warming up for space with your bodies, your physical and virtual presence. We're excited to have you here on screen and in person. Thanks, everybody. We're going to close up the Zoom now. Have a great afternoon. Talk to you soon.
Bye. Talk
Ciao
soon.
for now.
Bye.
Bye.